In a typical winter morning, the police department of a small town received two alarming calls. The officers went to the house at the given address, where they were waiting for a shocking picture. What happened next resembled the plot of a detective thriller, and it took 7 years to solve this terrible story. Only after all this time, the truth became known to everyone, but not everyone was ready for such an outcome. Friends, after viewing, I recommend to subscribe to my channel and also to like. It is very important for me. Connie Dade was born on July 31, 1976 in the small American town of Ellington, Connecticut. Her parents also had 2 daughters and a brother. From an early age, the girl was distinguished for her kindness and desire to help people, so she had many friends. Because of these qualities, Connie decided to pursue a medical degree. She graduated from the University of Connecticut and then joined the sales department of a pharmaceutical company. In addition, Connie became vice president of her city's charity, which provided free emergency medical care. The girl also wanted to create a large and friendly family. At the beginning of the zero, she had this opportunity. She met a man named Richard, and they began an affair. The couple married on July 4, 2003, and a few years later they had a son. 3 years later, a second boy appeared in the family. Around the same time, Connie and Richard decided to get a new home. They bought a large house in a quiet area on the outskirts of Ellington, and the family moved there. This place was an ideal choice for a large family. In addition to being very spacious, their sons could play in the large backyard. In addition, close friends of Richard and Connie lived in the same area and spent time together with their families. For many years, they lived an exemplary life, but on December 23, 2015, everything changed. This morning, the police department received 2 calls at once. First, the security company called and told them that Richard and Connie's house had been set off by an alarm. 5 minutes later, Richard called the police and asked for help. The officers immediately came to the house, where they were waiting for a terrible picture. One of them went inside through the open front door and immediately saw a trail of blood leading towards the kitchen from the staircase to the basement. The policeman proceeded to the kitchen, where he found Richard. The man was partially tied to an overturned chair with braces and lying face down on the floor. Wounds were seen on his body, and the man had another plastic tie around his neck. The officer called out to him, and Richard answered with one sentence: "He is still in the house." The police immediately requested help and began to search both the building and the entire area. Immediately after that, they were waiting for another terrible find. Going down to the basement, they saw their Connie's body, next to which there was a gun. Meanwhile, the detectives released Richard, and while they waited for the ambulance, the man told them what had happened. This morning about 8:10, he took his sons to a bus stop from which they left for school, before returning home. There he changed into his office clothes, got in his car, and went to work. Meanwhile, Connie was going to a sports class at a local charity gym. Shortly after Richard left the house, he received a security alert from the security company about the alarm in his house. It wasn't the first time this happened, and the reason was their cat, which they left at home alone. The man also realized that he had forgotten to take his laptop, which he needed for work, so he decided to come back. Before he turned around, he texted his supervisor that he was going to be late and back. Richard returned to the house between 8:45 and 9:00 a.m. Entering the house, he heard a noise on the second floor. He went upstairs to Connie's bedroom and, to his horror, saw an unknown man rummaging through their closet. The man was wearing camouflage clothes and his face was covered. As soon as the criminal saw Richard, he attacked him and pushed him to the floor. The unsub then demanded to be given his wallet, bank cards and PIN codes. Otherwise, he threatened to wait for his family to return home and kill him. Almost immediately afterwards, Richard heard the garage door open. Apparently, Connie came home early from her class. The man shouted that there was someone in the house and told her to run. The criminal headed downstairs, but Richard tried to stop him. During the struggle, an unknown man pushed him down the stairs and Richard flew to the first floor. While he was recovering, Connie ran to the basement, where they kept 2 guns, and the perp followed her. A few moments later, Richard was able to get up and also went into the basement. but when he got down there, an unknown man was holding a gun, and the next second he shot Connie. The sound of the shot was so loud that Richard was almost deaf for a few minutes. He thought he heard a second clap soon, but was not sure. The criminal then forced Richard to sit on a chair and tied his arm and leg to it with plastic ties. He then laid down the gun, took the wire cutters lying in the basement, and inflicted several stab wounds on the man with their blade. Then the unsub dumped some things on the floor, took a gas burner, and started burning them. Apparently, he was trying to get rid of the evidence. He turned to Richard and pointed the torch at him. Because Richard was only partially tied to the chair, he managed to get up and dislodge the burner from the attacker's hand. Richard picked it up and pointed it at him, hiding a mask on his face. The criminal, who remained unarmed, immediately ran out of the basement. Shortly after, Richard went upstairs to call the police. While the man was talking about the incident, the police searched the house and the area several kilometers away, but they never found the suspect. The only thing they found was Richard's wallet lying on the front lawn. Investigators have called in canine dogs to try to pick up the trail of the killer. They gave them a sniff of the purse because the perp had been holding it for some time, but it didn't work because 3 different dogs kept bringing detectives back to Richard. After this, the canine dog led the dogs around the house, hoping that they could smell a stranger, but it also did not bring results. This seemed strange to detectives. Trained dogs are able to detect the presence of people even after a few days. But in this case, not one of the 3 dogs could smell anything. Another strange moment was the time frame of what happened. According to Richard, it was about 5 minutes between the time he entered the house and the time the perp escaped. Given that the men returned home between 8:40 and 9:00 a.m., it should have been over no later than 9:05. However, the security company did not inform the police of the alarm at the house until 10 or 16 a.m. And a few minutes after that, Richard himself called. It turned out that he was in the house for more than an hour before going to the police. Besides, there wasn't much time between Connie going to sports and coming home. In the meantime, the man was taken to hospital and doctors determined that all the wounds he had received were not life-threatening. There, the detectives interviewed him again, hoping to get a description of the attacker. Richard said he was tall and big, but because of the mask, it was impossible to see his face. Medical examiners examined Connie's body and determined that she had received 2 bullet wounds, one to the abdomen and one to the back of the head. The detectives had virtually no leads, and they kept talking to Richard, hoping to get more details. The more questions they asked, the more suspicious the answers were. Originally, the man said that he left his house for work while Connie was going to practice, but at the hospital, he said he couldn't remember exactly which one left first. He also did not remember whether his wife had set the alarm before leaving or not. Richard also changed his version of the incident. Initially, he said he heard a noise on the 2nd floor as soon as he entered the house, but now he said that there was no noise, and he only noticed the criminal when he went upstairs and entered the bedroom. The man also said that the perp did not push him down the stairs of the 2nd floor, and he himself stumbled and fell, but the main inconsistency was related to the time of the murder. Richard said he ran into the basement and saw the perp take Connie's gun, then shoot her. However, he initially said he did not know how the assailant got hold of the gun. Besides, according to the man, it was pitch black in the basement, and the detectives wondered how he could see what was happening. Richard also added that he had not seen Connie's body due to darkness, so he was not sure his wife was dead. Another suspicious moment was the wounds Richard had received from the wire cutters. All of them were superficial and posed no threat, but what's interesting is that most of it was on the left side of the torso. Given that the man was right-handed and that it was the right hand that was not tied to the chair, he could have inflicted these wounds on himself. There was also no bruising or bruising on his body. According to the man, he struggled with the criminal and fell down the stairs, which was supposed to lead to abrasions, but they were not there. Richard's shorts had blood on them, but Kisu also found inconsistencies with his story. If the man had been stabbed with a sharp object while he was sitting on the chair, at least a few drops of blood would have been applied to the lower part, but there was no trace. The same goes for the place in the basement where the perp hit Richard with the wire cutters. There should have been a lot of blood on the floor where the chair was, but forensics only found a few small drops. But that's not all. According to Richard, after the criminal escaped, he regained consciousness for some time and then crawled up the stairs from the basement to the first floor. However, there was no blood on the steps, although the man was wounded and should have bled out. Another strange detail caught the attention of the detectives. As they examined the crime scene, they noticed that the window in the basement was open. The police admitted that the perp could have entered the house through him, but there was one interesting thing. Locks were pulled out of the window, and this was done from the inside. At another window, they were also pulled out. The investigators decided to do a little experiment. They tried to open it from the outside, but it only happened when one of the policemen struck the frame and knocked it down, breaking the window. Thus, the detectives doubted that the criminal could have opened the window, even without locks, without breaking the glass. This led the investigators to believe that Richard's story might have been fabricated. They went back to the hospital and asked him if he and Connie had any marital problems. The man said he had a mistress, but Connie didn't know. According to his story, he and his wife wanted to have a third child, but Connie couldn't get pregnant, so Richard suggested surrogacy, and he chose his former classmate to play that mother. She recently got divorced and wanted to have a baby. Husband and wife offered her the following plan. She will give birth from Richard, and then the three of them will raise this child. The woman agreed. They had originally planned to undergo a medical insemination procedure, but the service was too expensive. They decided to do it more naturally, and Richard made intimate contact with her, after which she became pregnant. According to him, he was totally cool with it and supported everything that was happening. The detectives very much doubted the veracity of the story, as it sounded completely unnatural. They kept asking Richard more questions, and his story changed again. Just minutes after this story, he stated that Connie and his girlfriend had never met or even talked. He also said he wasn't sure if his wife knew about the pregnancy. Though after further talking to the police, he admitted at all that he had been cheating on his wife with his former classmate for several years and that Connie was unaware of what was happening. Detectives contacted this woman, and she said she had been romantically involved with Richard less than a year earlier. She knew he was married, but thought the man was in the process of divorcing her because he had told her himself. The woman got pregnant in June, 6 months before it happened. Richard insisted that he had already hired a lawyer for the divorce and was going to complete the process by the time the child was born. However, the investigators found out that the man had not actually consulted a lawyer. Besides, everyone Connie knew said she never mentioned divorce. All this was enough for the detectives to start looking at Richard as the prime suspect. However, they could not find any hard evidence against him, so the police began to consider all possible options. This is where they found something interesting. Friends and relatives of the family told them that Connie had complained about a construction worker with whom they had problems. He did some bad work on their house, and the couple tried to get some of the money back, but the contractor turned out to be very aggressive, and Connie admitted that she feared him seriously. It was because of this problem that he and Richard bought 2 pistols and also installed an alarm system. Investigators looked into the man, but he had an uncontested alibi for the time of the murder. They eventually returned to their only suspect, the victim's husband. For months, the police had not told the public that they thought he was a possible murderer. All of Connie's acquaintances and relatives believed that there was an unknown robber behind the crime and felt sorry for Richard. The detectives spent a lot of time talking to Connie's closest friends. They stated that the woman would have clearly told them if she had known about her husband's affair, especially if his mistress had become pregnant. Other family friends noted that after the murder, Richard behaved strangely. He did not look depressed or upset, and a few days after his wife died, he actually texted a few neighbors where you usually order food. Digging deeper, the police discovered that Connie and Richard were in serious financial trouble. Meanwhile, the wife did not understand where their money was going, while Richard was secretly spending them on his mistress. Her smartphone also found a note with a headline, Why do I want a divorce? There were women who said that Richard was always lying, mistreating her and her children, taking her money without asking, and so on. Therefore, the investigators concluded that Connie herself had thought of ending the marriage, but that she had no idea of her husband's secret life. Investigating the financial side of the matter in more detail, the police discovered that just 5 days after the murder, Richard had attempted to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's insurance account. But security denied it. A month later, he received a check from his wife's employer for $75,000. All of this suggested that Richard may have had an ulterior motive to kill, but did not prove his guilt. Another curious fact was that Richard cancelled the contract with the preservation firm just 19 days after the murder. If his story about the perpetrator were true, it would be the most illogical move, jeopardizing not only the man himself, but also his 2 sons. Trying to find any evidence, the detectives got a warrant to go through every electronic device in the house. Here they were finally waiting for something serious. Having gathered all this information together, the police were able to reconstruct the exact chronology of events. On the morning of 8:44, the security system recorded the garage door opening and closing. Investigators determined it was Connie who went to practice, as she had already been caught on the cameras near the gym at 8:53. At 8:50, Richard, who was still at home at the time, first disabled the alarm and then turned it back on again. After that, he had to leave the house and go to work. But at 8:59, the man again switches off the alarm using his remote. Given that he was only a few meters from the system itself, Richard had to come home. It was consistent with his story that he was driving back to pick up the laptop. But there was one problem. A man said that he had received an alarm on his way to work. However, no violations were recorded by the security system during this period, which means that no notification was received. At 9:02 p.m., Richard entered his email from a tablet and 2 minutes later wrote to his supervisor that he would be delayed because he had an alarm. There is another discrepancy. Not only that there were no alarm notices, but Richard also lied about the letter to the police. He said he sent it right after he received the notification, a few kilometers from his home. But the tablet data showed that he was at home at the time the letter was sent because he was connected to a home Wi-Fi. The man was in the house for at least 4 minutes before he found the robber, and everything that happened next took less than a minute, which was impossible, even in theory. But the most important piece of evidence was Connie's fitness bracelet. She arrived at the gymnasium at 8:53, but she got out a few minutes later after class was cancelled. At 9:08 p.m., the bracelet stopped reading the steps, which led investigators to conclude that Connie got into the car and drove home. It took 8 minutes to get there, and this is where Richard said the perp attacked his wife right after she entered the house. But the data from the bracelet denied this. The woman walked 370 meters inside her home between 9:18 and 10:17 a.m. Data from her social media account also showed that she was online for 6 minutes in that time range. So Connie entered the house at 9:18 and was alive for almost an hour, which is completely inconsistent with her husband's story. An important factor here was that the police had not just theoretical inconsistencies on their hands, but full digital evidence. It took the police more than a year to gather this detailed information, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For the vast majority of his acquaintances, this event was a real shock. They all had no idea what evidence the police had been able to gather, and continued to consider Richard a victim. The man was accused of murder and initially wanted bail of $5 million, but his lawyer insisted that Richard had a clean criminal record, as well as 2 minor sons in care. As a result, the amount was reduced to $1 million, and he immediately deposited the money. Richard spent 5 years awaiting trial because the trial was constantly delayed. It only began in April 2022, and during this time, the lawyer of the man managed to collect many interesting facts. The defense provided evidence that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown person were found in the house. They also indicated that very little gunpowder had been found on Richard's hands. If he had been the one who fired the shot, it would have been much larger. the prosecution disproved these arguments. It was not until a few hours after the man was taken to hospital that the gunpowder was tested. In that time, Richard could have wiped out most of the footprints. As for the DNA, there was no evidence that it belonged to the mystery man. These samples could have come from anyone visiting Richard and Connie's house at least once. In turn, the prosecution provided a detailed digital map of the spouse's movements that morning, which refuted Richard's claim. The evidence indicated that the woman died an hour after she was allegedly shot by an unidentified plunder. So far, she's been moving around the house and using social media as if nothing happened. Richard's story was also a powerful argument for the prosecution, as the men changed their testimony repeatedly. All the contradictions in his words were used as further proof of the falsity of his story. The trial lasted 22 days, and on 10 May 2022, a jury found him guilty. Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison. However, he maintained his innocence. His trial was a terrible ordeal for Connie's family and friends, as they learned of all the evidence against her husband only during the trial. Until this point, many of them continued to believe the story of the unknown robber, but after all the cards were laid on the table, there was no doubt that Richard was guilty. However, the men's lawyers have announced plans to appeal the sentence until it is reviewed, but so far they have not had the desired result. As for Connie's sons, they stayed with Mom's relative. They were 6 and 9 years old at the time of the murder, but the children lived with their father until sentencing. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and make sure to like under this clip. If you liked it, also recommend subscribing to my channel, where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thanks for watching,